Hello, humans, and welcome to Canadian Fakin'. This is episode 33 of your Power Report. I'm Dan from the internet, and there's a lot going on in the United States right now. The day-to-day drama of progressives battle with the Trump Democrats like Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin over the dueling budget reconciliation bills and the infrastructure bill are really, really sweet and interesting to watch. You're really seeing everyone's true colors on the left, on the right of the Democratic Party, like in all parts of the Democratic Party. It's really knives out and it's really great to watch. And so I want to it's enticing and I want to continue following it. I am following it. But once it sort of wraps up and we get a conclusion out of all of this, so we don't get lost in the minutia of the day to day, what's going on, um, we're going to talk about it in a proper episode later. So right now I want to talk about, get an opportunity to shift gears on this edition of Power Report and talk about world news, talk about what we can learn from some recent elections that have concluded in Canada in the first part of this episode and in Germany in the second part of this episode. And maybe there's some things we can learn, but I want to also make the distinction that these are different countries with vastly different histories than the United States. And while you can draw similarities because we're all existing in the same context and time, there are different historical contexts for each of these countries. And so any similarities that you're drawing are not absolute or final. Just keep that in mind. I don't want to lose sight about what's happening around the world, though, because I think there are a lot of important lessons, that caveat being said, that can be drawn out for the left. And so I want to present the opportunity to do that. So let's get started with this episode. First, I was joined by
Sandee. I have a YouTube channel called Left of the Box where I dive into Canadian politics and social issues. And I try to look at it from a perspective of people with disabilities and poverty. Those are things that I have personal experience with. And I find that they're not talked about very often on the main stage. We tend to be excluded from the conversation a lot of the time.
Sandee can be found on Twitter at Sandee Lovas and at youtube.com/left of the box. Once you start to hear Sandee and the way that Sandee dissects Canadian politics, you want to make sure you're following youtube.com/left of the box. And then later on the show, Sean, Power Report regular, will join me to go to Europe and the German elections, where we had some really interesting developments for the left, actually, for once, that might, have some interesting context for the future. So before we begin, though, I think it's a really useful for a breakdown on how parliamentary systems work as well. Sean gave a really great breakdown about that because Canada and Germany both have parliamentary systems. And so I'm going to copy paste that part from the second part of the episode right here, just as a primer.
But how it works in Germany for like the political process is you don't vote for a candidate. You vote for a party who then puts in a central figurehead or two, depending on the party, as their representative leaders.
Very similar to, I was just going to say, just for the context of this episode, similar to Canada.
Yes, very similar to Canada.
And I gave you that warning so you don't get deja vu when you hear it again later in the episode. And I get deja vu about hearing myself and hearing the audience, and hearing the people I'm interviewing and then editing the people I'm interviewing a lot. So trust me, I'm used to it. But yeah, it's really important to understand parliamentary systems and the way they are organized, even though Germany and Canada have slight variations on the parliamentary system, because then you'll understand how the elections work and how it's very different from the United States. Anyways, you can also, by the way, find Sean, of course, on episodes of Power Report and with me on AudioFace. It was really interesting because we're usually doing a music podcast together, but this time we were doing a political podcast together. And Sean's very knowledgeable on German history and German politics, and so it was really great to talk to him about that. All right, let's go. Sandee, so thank you very much for joining me. I'm really excited to get to talk to you about Canadian politics because I'm admittedly very ignorant about it, but thankfully on this show, I think it'll be a really great learning experience for myself and the audience to really get a knowledgeable leftist perspective on the situation in Canada and what is going on. But so before we get into the most recent Canadian elections, they were like a snap election type of process where Justin Trudeau was sort of able to call it in supposedly emergency circumstances. But I think before we even get into the not so emergency circumstances, in fact, the unusual circumstances in which the snap election was even called for, which I think there's a lot of controversy, can you just give our audience a bit of like a quick cursory overview of the Canadian political parties, the ones that are like most active, that have like the major play in Canadian government, before we kind of give some context as to why Justin Trudeau felt so confident to even call the snap election in the first place?
Okay, so we have five main parties, although I don't know if the Green Party really counts because they're so tiny. There's the Liberal Party, which would be very similar to your Democratic Establishment Party, neoliberal, kind of. They're not really center, they're somewhat a bit to the right at times. Then there's the Conservative Party. They're bad. They've kind of stopped hiding some of their more racist tendencies. The current leader did try to go a little bit more center on the environment, but that was rejected by the party overall. So it's a mixed bag, but they're trying to get more popularity, and much like your Conservative Party in the States, to try to get that popularity, they're moving more right. Then there's the NDP, the New Democrat Party. They would be similar to, I guess, your Squad. They're more progressive. They want things like universal pharmacare, universal childcare, some sort of guaranteed livable income, looking after working people, that sort of thing. And then the other major player is the Bloc Québécois. They only exist in Quebec. They are a separatist party. So the most they can ever win is 78 out of the 338 seats because, like I said, they only have ridings in Quebec. And their primary goal is to eventually separate from Canada, be their own independent country. There was a referendum on that back in the 90s, and it was a sliver margin of a vote to keep them actually in Canada. And then we do have a Green Party, but the Green Party is an absolute mess right now. They only have 2 seats in the House. There was a lot of, when we start talking more about it, the election, there was a lot of stuff that happened in there that I'm surprised they managed to maintain any semblance of a party going forward. So it's, and then there's like 16 other small parties that, people try to go for. One of the ones that we have to be a bit wary of is the People Party of Canada, the PPC. They're the kind of conspirators, more racist, more right-wing than the Conservatives. And considering the Conservative slogan for this last election was "Secure the Future," that's saying a lot. And their rise in popularity is very worrying.
I think for Americans, I think it's always interesting to see what will get. I think I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but I think what Americans might first see is, oh, how interesting, a parliamentary system with more than 2 parties and effective power. I think we'll kind of learn in reality, unfortunately in Canada, that's not quite the truest thing. There are effectively 2 parties that like have the most power in Canada still. But you get so many flavors of a lot of different ideologies, and unfortunately, because of like other tendencies, you tend to be getting like in other parts of the world, especially in the United States. Because unfortunately, I'm getting a lot of conservatives in Canada who seem to be taking cues from conservatives in the United States down to complaining about Americans not being able to say our national anthem. Like, you're Canadian, why do you care? But the fact that you have even like a flavor of the right wing that is even more extreme than the already extreme conservative party is really worrying, actually. Doesn't really bode well for the future of Canada if they get more power, I don't think, right?
Yeah, like Canada loves to portray this image to the rest of the world that we're a very progressive country, we're very accepting, that sort of thing. But when you look at what our exports are, you have oil and white nationalism. Like, the Proud Boys started here. We've sent you a lot of white nationalists that have, like Jordan Peterson and all that sort of stuff. So it is a problem here.
Yeah. And so let's get into more of why Justin Trudeau called this election in the first place, because um, I think the election was scheduled for 2 years in. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the regular election would have been scheduled for at least like a year and a half out, right? So you would have had, maybe COVID-19 would have been a little bit more handled. Vaccines hopefully will have permeated more throughout Canadian society by then. And so, why did Justin Trudeau choose to call the snap election like right now and then like send Canada into this um hundreds of millions of dollars of a frenzy? And what was the result of that? Like, were there any gains from this effort?
Yeah, it was the most expensive election in our history with the lowest turnout to get almost the exact same results and the ruling party to have the lowest percentage of the popular vote ever. Justin Trudeau, he called it basically because he wanted a power grab. Polling suggested that he had the chance of winning a majority because before the election and currently, he has a minority. So he doesn't have 50% of the seats in Parliament. So if the Liberals want to pass anything, they have to team up with one of the other parties to actually get the votes through. And he was hoping, just based on the polling, that he could get it so that they could get just over that 50% of seats in the House. So then they could just pass whatever they want because they don't really like working with the other parties so much. And that is all, because really in Canada, we have the 4-year frame between elections. But in between that, you should only be really calling an election if the throne speech doesn't pass, a money bill doesn't pass, or a motion of non-confidence is made and passed. Those are really the only reasons, barring extreme circumstances, why an election should be called. There is absolutely no reason to call this, especially during our fourth wave going into COVID. It put everyone at risk. He kept the election period to the shortest possible time frame of 36 days, which I imagine to you Americans sounds quite lovely.
Divine.
Tiny. Our longest periods are 50 days. But I find the problem with that is that Canadians only really plug into politics sort of during an election campaign. And so they're not absorbing a lot of information. The parties aren't getting out information. So it's very easy for Canadians to remain unplugged and just vote for the same party that they've always voted for without actually checking the records or getting into the details of. Liberals make promises all the time that sound great. They do not keep them at all. The amount of broken promises they have is just, it's crazy. And yet people will still vote for them, or people will still say, oh, they're promising universal childcare if they get a majority. They've been promising universal childcare since the 90s. It's just something that people seem to continuously fall for because we're so unplugged from politics. And yeah, we only ever have two parties that have been in charge of the country, and that's the Conservatives and the Liberals. Because having a parliamentary system can be beneficial because you have the influence of the other parties, but we don't have proportional representation. It's a first past the post system. So right now the Liberals have they're the ones in charge. They have 32% of the popular vote, which is just crazy. The Conservatives have more in the popular vote, but it's just the way it's laid out. Like when you compare, the biggest difference is between the NDP and the Bloc Québécois. The NDP has 17% of the popular vote. The Bloc has just under 8% of the popular vote, and yet the Bloc has 33 seats and the NDP has 25. So it doesn't actually reflect what Canadians want. It's just basically in any given riding, we don't vote for our prime minister here. We vote for a party and we vote for a member of parliament in our riding. And if you have let's say we have 10 candidates and 100 votes. 8 of those candidates receive 10 votes, but then one candidate receives 9 votes and another candidate receives 11 votes. Then the person with the 11 votes wins, despite the fact that it's nowhere near 50%.
Yeah, and despite the fact that in that example, you have a large number of people who did not participate in that process. And so, similarly, to give it to like a context for viewers of PowerPort recently, what happened in the California recall, where you could essentially have a vast minority of actual people elect a governor, given a certain like kind of circumstance. It seems to be my understanding that that's a lot of what happens in the Canadian system when you're electing at least like representatives and things like that. And so it kind of baffles me again, like where this was a very expensive election. Again, vastly, I mean, again, not to make mass comparisons, vastly less expensive than even like the American elections, which individual candidates on the congressional level may spend the American equivalent to $600 billion Canadian. But, now presidential candidates, I think Obama was the first one to shoot past $1 billion in his campaign alone. And so it just really, I think we're starting to get like numb to a lot of these numbers here. But the fact that even with all that effort, there's effectively no change and not even a lot of participation on the Democratic level, I think says to something that I could at least parallel in America slightly, which seems to be that the broader Canadian public, or correct me if I'm wrong here, is it that the broader Canadian public feels disenfranchised? Like either is the reason behind the lack of voting here something that is systemic? Like, are there efforts to suppress the vote similar to as there are in the United States, or is it a matter of people going, okay, it's this two-party system, it's kind of rigged to begin with, I don't feel like my vote matters necessarily, to kind of like sloppily apply an American contextual bit of discourse to Canadian politics? What does that sort of look like on the level to explain the lack of turnout there?
I think most Canadians were just frustrated because it feels like nothing will change. It's liberal Tory, same old story. Because in a lot of ridings, it really is true, your vote doesn't necessarily matter. Because as soon as a candidate hits a plurality, that riding is won. So, you can have all the NDP support you want across the country, but unless they're winning the ridings, it has zero impact on the overall shape of the country. And we don't have voter suppression the same way as in the States, but there were a lot of issues this round. In Canada, we have Elections Canada. So they're funded by the government, but they're kind of independent from the government, and they run all of our elections, provincially and federally. And this time, there were no polling stations on college and university campuses, which is not common. That's very uncommon for us. So a lot of students weren't able to gain access to vote because they'd have to travel away from their campuses, and who has a car? A lot of Indigenous communities didn't receive a polling station. And it's not like they can just go to a neighboring community because these communities are spread out far, far apart. There were fewer polling stations than there has been in the past. In Toronto in particular, it was pretty bad. There was lineups that were 2 hours long. And for us, that's long. I've seen the stories in the States, but the vast majority of elections I've been in, you just walk in and vote. It's just as simple as that. Like, I moved recently, so all I had to do was walk in with, something to prove my new address and change it on the spot, and no issues, no questions asked. So we do have access to voting. There were a lot more mail-in votes this time because of the fear of COVID, but a lot of those mail-in votes came in too late for people to actually send them back on time, which was, again, another issue and another problem. Like, we spent, for us, it was $610 million, which I think in American dollars is like 79. I don't know. Conversion. I'm bad at that. So we spent all this money to get an election process that wasn't nearly as smooth as we have had in the past. Apparently, some money had to go into training for the extra COVID measures, security at some of the polling stations, because this election in particular, things were starting to get pretty violent. At one campaign stop, Justin Trudeau was at, somebody was throwing like actual rocks at him. And the anti-maskers in Canada, they're becoming a problem. Like, they've been blocking off hospitals, so people can't even get into hospitals. The threats of violence are on the increase. Just people's general attitude, it's becoming more dangerous during election season. So a lot of people, they didn't want to deal with like an anti-masker at a polling station. So you had fewer people that wanted to be in a polling station, to work in a polling station. Plus, a lot of the polling stations are run by people who are seniors, and they were afraid of COVID, so they didn't want to run. So Elections Canada was extremely understaffed. And so a lot of Canadians that may have wanted to vote weren't able to vote. So this election turnout was only 58% of the people who could vote came out. And of that, 32% went to the Liberals. So that's, when you look at the overall population of Canada, that's a tiny percentage of people that the Liberals now claim they have a clear mandate to rule over, which no, you don't. They
Yeah.
ended up being, they
No,
ended up
go on.
being, they ended up gaining 1.5 seats. And what I mean by that is, one of their candidates, a few days before the election, it was revealed that he had sexual assault allegations. He was charged with it, but apparently those charges were dropped, but he didn't disclose that during the vetting process. And so the Liberal Party wanted to, they said that they're not going to let him sit as a Liberal because it was so close to the election, he still won as a Liberal, which really upset a lot of people, because had they known about this ahead of time, they might have changed their vote. The people who have gone to early polling stations, mail-in votes, a lot of people are unhappy with this. So even though he's going to be sort of sitting as an independent, he's still going to vote with the Liberals all the time, because at this moment, he says that he's not planning on stepping down as an MP, which there's just no accountability. There were 5 other candidates that during the election had to drop out for sexual assault allegations, for anti-Semitic tweets that were revealed, Islamic phobic tweets that were revealed. Like, I know the vetting system is better than that. And so for these to come out after the point of no return on the ballot, I find is very suspicious. It's almost like they were hoping that they could just slide it through without people noticing.
And it also seems like the Liberal Party, making a political calculation about how razor thin the margins are, figured out that, similarly, again, to draw another parallel in America, how Democrats got really, really mum about Me Too and about some of Joe Biden's on camera creepiness when it came to the Tara Reid stuff. And there were like at least some like allegations that were coming forward about Joe Biden's like potential behavior, not just like with that instance, but in others overall. And Democrats who were very eager, I would argue like rightfully so, at least 2 years ago, to want to hold Trump and Republicans and folks in the media and folks in other very high visibility industries accountable. Now that the Me Too movement has sort of, you know, not the talk of the news every single day. There's less talk about, okay, who are people who are less visible in these spaces and what kind of justice comes for them. People who don't work in the media, but people who work in often exploitative working conditions where it makes sexual harassment that much more dangerous and harmful. And to say nothing about the fact that, like, the hypocrisy you have here on the political level, that these people will use the activism around this very important moment as a tool to get elected. But when it comes time to be accountable, they sort of just will let that fall by the wayside and won't really care about it too much. Um, I just think that's really interesting. And I'll also make one clarification though, just because I guess I am the money guy. $600 million Canadians, around 474,000 US dollars, just because of good old exchange rates. But no, that's just a clarification. But I don't know if you had any thoughts on like that, just sort of the way that the Liberal Party will use like these sort of movements to their own advantage, cynically.
Yeah, Justin Trudeau is absolutely notorious for that sort of thing. He will go, give a few tears at a ceremony for Indigenous peoples. But then on September 30th was our first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, to reflect on the crimes committed against Indigenous peoples, to, raise their stories up. And it's supposed to be a day of like reflection and thinking and understanding. He went on a vacation to a beach in BC for the first day, for the first one. He went on a vacation. It'd be like going on vacation for Veterans Day or Remembrance Day, or
for the first one, though, like the very first Veterans Day, where like you are elected in office to like make Veterans Day happen. One of the easier things to do in America is just make a holiday happen. Like this doesn't happen very much in America because work sets you free here, but and even that doesn't really happen. But we got a new federal holiday out of Juneteenth recently, and I, as like an extremely cynical, radical at Black American, I was actually sort of like, okay, this isn't like the end of the struggle, but hey, it's a day off, and it's recognizing this sort of somber moment in Black American history that a lot of Americans, white Americans, and other folks of colors didn't even really know about, just because of how like poor it was taught about. But um, to think that Joe Biden didn't take a day off. Joe Biden was doing like events and stuff, and trying to acknowledge, like, I mean, if anything, it's a political victory lap for you. So like the fact that Justin Trudeau would do something like that sounds as like politically miscalculating as, repeatedly wearing blackface.
Yeah, like, and it's not just that he went on vacation. Like, seriously, he could have waited a day, but the official itinerary for the prime minister was released that he was supposed to be in meetings in Ottawa that day. Plus, it was revealed that he declined invites from Indigenous communities in BC that he was near to go and talk with them. Instead, he's like, yeah, he was on the phone to a couple residential school survivors during his day off, which,
That's literally phoning it in.
Yeah, like and there was another blackface photo of Justin Trudeau released a few days before the election. And the way that his supporters try to justify everything he does, I can't wrap my head around. It's like, well, he deserves a vacation, or well, he still made some phone calls, or like they are trying so hard to justify every single thing, and yet they rarely mention the blackface photos. And then some people even try to claim, well, he was brownface in some of them, and that's not really a thing.
Worst argument ever, honestly.
So the thing that just drives me crazy about this is, despite everything he does, you have his supporters just backing him, and he's never been held accountable for everything he's done. Like, there's 3 instances that we know of where he's worn blackface, and when asked how many times he has, he said he didn't know. Like, if you lost count, it's probably too many.
Yeah, it does inspire a lot of confidence when you're like, I mean, on the one hand, I'm not trying to be fair to the guy, but it's one of those like, how many times do you beat your wife questions? Like, there's not really a great way to get out of that. That being said, one great way to get out of it, Justin Trudeau, who like, it's not like he just, lackadaisically walked into politics. Trudeau is part of a very entrenched political family in Canada. You would think that he would know, oh, hey, maybe, if I have a political career in the future or not, the blackface might be a problem in that political future, or just that future, or just like as a moral person. I happen to have a lot of like white friends who, to my knowledge, just managed to make it through their years and didn't do blackface. So I don't know how Trudeau got himself into this situation, honestly.
I do theater. I love wearing costumes. Wearing blackface has never crossed my mind. It's yeah, he reeks of privilege and entitlement. Like, Pierre Trudeau was prime minister in Canada back in the early 80s. So that's his father. And so he does come from that political dynasty. I have issues with that because back when Pierre was prime minister, the Kamloops Residential School, which was in the news not too long ago, with the discovery of the 215 children in a grave, his dad was prime minister during that time. Like, how much do you think Justin is actually going to look into that? And something that, again, a lot of Canadians are forgetting is that these discoveries have continued to happen. And the news is not saying anything about it. There are thousands of newly discovered graves that are not being talked about by the mainstream media at all. And that's something that could have been, talked about on the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and yet they were quiet about it. And when it comes to things like the sexual assault allegations in his party, like, one of the people who had to drop out earlier in this election was because he had sexual assault allegations against him. But apparently something new came up because Justin Trudeau knew about this before this guy became a candidate and defended it, saying that they have a thorough process and they don't think anything bad happened. And previously, another Liberal candidate, Liberal MP, had to step down as an MP because he was charged with break and entering and stalking, basically. And so he still has to go to court for that. Luckily, he didn't. He decided not to try to run again this time. And these are the type of people that seem to be drawn to the Liberal Party. And when people just try to brush it off like their allegations, charges were dropped, what that tells people who have been victims of these sorts of things is that they don't matter, that they don't care, that if the allegations were false, and I say if because I'm not too hopeful that they're false. It tells, mostly women and non-binary folk that present female, that they're okay with having these people in office. That somehow, out of the thousands and thousands of people in a riding, they couldn't find somebody who hasn't had allegations leveled against them. And you see how they support each other and how they, back up each other. And it just tells women, minorities, people with disabilities that in Canada, we simply don't matter. And it makes me sick because I'm a person with disabilities, mental health issues. What this government has done to us is gross. We can now apply for medical assistance in dying. It's called MAID. Without any other help. So there's no offer to help us with housing. There's no offer to increase our payments to meet the poverty line. We're usually 30 to 40% under the poverty line and expected to survive on that. Some of our medications aren't covered. A lot of our medical needs aren't covered. So they're not willing to help us in life at all, but they're more than happy to help us die. And that's the state of our government right now. And that's why, like, a lot of people, it's like, oh, well, the Liberals aren't so bad. I just want to scream at them because we are suffering and dying under the Liberals. And people just brush it off because, I want to try to blame the United States for this one. A lot of people point at the United States and say we're not that bad. So, yeah, our healthcare system is being dismantled. Yes, we aren't looking after people, but we're not as bad as you guys. So really, we shouldn't be complaining at all. It's
That's
the
a
general attitude.
that's a really interesting dynamic, and like to see America being used as, oh well, at least we're not X, Y, or Z here. It's something I definitely, even myself, don't think about as like America through all of the goodwill it has built with, elites over the past 100 years, because it has enriched world elites by modernizing colonialism, if you will, and bringing it to a hyper industrial capitalist age where now the U.S. is getting beaten by its own game by China and other countries who are just like developing capitalism in like newer, almost more exploitative ways, in conjunction with the United States still. But you still have this feeling that, whatever the United States is doing, we can sort of follow the lead from. Again, sort of among the elites. I think you sort of get this in filtering throughout culture as well. Like I do a music podcast, and a lot of music internationally follows cues from America. Although I think a lot of the cooler music as well tends to come from other countries more like natively. But again, that's a different podcast. Uh, but ultimately, the idea that I wanted to kind of get from what you said, which was kind of amazing, that I think I'll take away from this, is that America being used by elites as an example of austerity politics, because the left so often tries to use the advantage, or like the example of um, social welfare programs that exist in Europe, in countries like Germany or in England or in countries like Canada. When we talk about y'all's healthcare system, we're constantly making the distinction between how much the price of prescription drugs cost in Canada as opposed to they do in the United States, because of the way that pharmacare in Canada is able to negotiate for those prescription drug prices in some context, right? It's not the story that Americans don't get, is that that's not fully comprehensive. It's not complete. It doesn't do everything. Um, and it's leaving a lot to be desired by. But the fact that in the past 10, 15 years, it's being actively cut is the difference. Like it's being actively scaled back and taken away. And so, what is in America, similarly, it's very bleak. But like you mentioned, there are some political parties in Canada. You mentioned like the New Democratic Party. There's been some really like figures from the NDP who have started to make some international waves a little bit, at least in online leftist spaces. Um, what is the insurgent left response look like in Canada, at least on the um, political level, before we go to like the grassroots level? And what sort of policy agendas or like agenda items are they really trying to put forward in place right now? um like in America, priorities, and in a lot of like leftist insurgent parties around the world, priorities really shift around climate change right now, especially. But what is the left really fighting for right now, and what is their progress, at least when it comes to inside of the political system?
Okay. So just before I get to the NDP, I just want to say like part of the reason why I think Canada and the United States, we need more cross-border solidarity with the left is the way I see the dynamic is the American people see what the Canadian people get and say, I want that. Meanwhile, the Canadian government looks at what the American government gets away with and says they want that. And right now, the Canadian government is winning that dynamic. So how much harder will it be for you guys if one day you can no longer say, well, look at the drug prices in Canada, they're so cheap? Like, what happens when that's no longer an issue? What happens, like, would you guys have gotten marriage equality if we hadn't done it first? Our countries are so fundamentally tied together and we take cues from each other. And this is why, like, our left needs to work with your left more. So we have the NDP, and they are pushing for more left-leaning policies, but they often don't go far enough. So one thing that they promised was to build 500,000 affordable homes over the next 10 years. We need that in Ontario now, and that won't even solve the problem. because we have a housing crisis that is just as bad and probably in some places a lot worse than yours. And so the NDP is like our best hope, I guess you could say, of starting to move things in a more left-leaning direction. And with a minority government, there is still at least the possibility of getting some more left-leaning bills through. Like we got the $2,000 a month that Canada likes to brag about, which was not granted to every Canadian. It was means tested, and it left millions with nothing. But it did help a lot of people. The only reason why we got that was because of the NDP. They were pushing for it. They pushed to, put a freeze on student loans. So they do push the Liberals more left on certain things. But when it comes to like taxing the wealthy or taxing the corporations, the Liberals and Conservatives vote the same all the time. And so they don't need the NDP support. They have the Conservative support for that sort of stuff. Like if you want to buy in their pipeline, they're both those parties are more than happy to do that. Our emissions have actually gone up over, the past year. We're not.
Even though, sorry to interrupt that, but like even though Justin Trudeau made such a big deal about being part of the Paris Climate Accords when Donald Trump left office, right? So like here is Justin Trudeau making a big deal, posturing off of America, this time using America as a different rhetorical tool, saying, hey, look at what we're doing in response to the barbaric Americans. We're Canada, this is who we are, this is what we're talking about. Who Canada is and what Canada is talking about is a concept that you brilliantly introduced me to when I was on Left of the Box, your show, which is maple washing. The idea that it's almost like Canadian exceptionalism. This idea that, we're just, we as Canadians, as I'm now saying this, are, just a little bit exceptional, just a little bit a cut above. We're nicer, we're kinder, we try to do things in a little bit more of a humane way. And so what maple washing does is it creates this, sort of easy narrative for people who want to have that sort of empty Canadian pride to have. Meanwhile, just barely, like not even talking just a little bit beneath the surface, it's all lies. The fact that emissions actually went up in Canada during COVID-19 when there are fewer people in cars, at least supposedly, fewer people traveling, all these different things. Justin Trudeau should be ashamed for all of the posturing he did, not even like months or recent years ago, not even 5 years ago, in his same administration, but he is doing right now, and going back on these climate accords. Yeah, I only wanted to point out there, but I think it's just so interesting that, yeah, that's something that no one's asking any elected official to do in America, is to build solidarity with the left in other countries, like politically, like actual political power, so we can start to say, okay, let's start to have human rights and start to have some consistent human rights structure that crosses borders while still respecting individual laws within those borders.
Yeah, because again, we're both G7 countries. Behind the scenes, Canada props up the United States in like overseas conflicts and all that sort of stuff. And unless the left starts working together, we're never going to get anything done. Because like recently in your news was the funding for the Iron Dome around Israel. Okay, so let's say you were able to push it through and so that funding didn't happen. It changes nothing because Canada is also sending money to Israel for weapons and stuff. Like, unless we do it together, it doesn't actually make a difference. And meanwhile, on the right, they joined forces at some of the encampments, the houseless encampments that we have in Canada, because we do have a lot of them. They get violently destroyed by police officers and private security. They spend millions and millions to, destroy these encampments when it would have cost just a fraction of the price to properly house everyone in it. And some of the private security were seen wearing US, Canada, thin blue line solidarity badges. So the right they're already working together. Meanwhile, on the left, like a prime example of this is when I was looking into politics on Canada more, because before I started my channel, I knew a bit, but I'm learning so much more now. We have a Communist Party and a Marxist-Leninist Party. They're the same thing, but they refuse to work together. It's the left just has no desire to work with each other. And then in the NDP, I know that there's a lot of fractures right now. Like, I still supported the NDP. I still asked people to vote for the NDP in this past election because they are our best hope. But like I said, their policies don't go far enough, and they're now rejecting people from that party who might be more left leaning. Because in Canada, you can't just run for a party. You have to, pass their vetting. The party itself has to approve each and every single candidate that they have. And so if they don't want people who believe a certain thing, they vet them out. So you never even have a chance to run as a candidate. And it's so frustrating that on the left, we can't seem to get it together. And the disturbing thing on the NDP is that they're getting rid of all these progressive people, and yet they still support the Premier of BC, who is NDP. So they're the provincial government there. And he's just out and out conservative when you actually look at the things that he's doing. He's a horrible person. There's the Fairy Creek issue right now around the trees, the largest trees in the world, being chopped down. Actually, I don't know if they're in the world, but they're pretty big trees, old growth forest. And they're trying to prevent the logging of it. And the Oregon government has sent in police and violence and RCMP, and it's been brutal. And during their heat waves there and stuff, he was just, telling people, oh, well, you need to basically go indoors and turn on the air conditioner. And it's like, okay, if you're living on the streets, like, who's going to accept you in their home so you can enjoy their air conditioner? And hundreds of people died during that. A town was wiped off the map because of a forest fire. And it took him 1-2 days to actually call in and see how some of them are doing, because it was an Indigenous community. He was more concerned about their cattle than he was about the actual people making it to safety. And so Horgan is horrible, because then what that tells people is that if the NDP gets into power, this is what you can expect, a complete turnaround. And so it would have been really important for Jagmeet Singh to say, I don't agree with this, or, I don't appreciate this. Instead, he was like, he's our guy. We like him. We support him. And meanwhile, they did nothing to help support some of the progressive, I believe it was Nikki Ashton, who had a conference call with Jeremy Corbyn to talk about, solidarity, international solidarity. And by apparently talking to him, you're accused of being anti-Semitic and stuff. And she got very, very little support from the actual NDP on what she was trying to do. And so the more progressive people in the party already don't receive much support from the overall organization. So even the NDP is starting to move more towards the center, which, I wish I could say I'm more hopeful about the situation, but unless there's a major overhaul of that party, I don't know how. Because, there are going to be people who want to fight back, but if the party doesn't let you in, there's no way to actually change the party from within.
Yeah, I see some really chilling parallels. For one, I hope the trajectory of the NDP changes, or that they understand, or at least figure out how to do politics a little bit better. I'm not gonna say as an American, oh, I know exactly what the NDP should do based off of just one conversation here, right? But I see so many parallels with the fact that you don't need to know a lot about American politics or Canadian politics to know that the way to win in politics in a democratic system where you have to rely on people's support for you is to win their trust, is to say, I'm going to fight for you, and to prove it in some way. If you've never been a politician before, then you prove it through forms of activism that you can do outside of office, or at least being present in certain situations. If you're in office, then you have like even less of an excuse. You've got to have something there to speak to, or like some legislation, some action to speak to you talking the talk and walking the walk at the same time. But the more and more that the left chooses not to hold their ground, but to continue to embrace these bad faith sort of attacks on their own, I mean, not only does that discourage people who are within that coalition to me, who are like, okay, well, if I'm part of the NDP and I stick my neck out for these issues that I agree on, or like my constituents agree on, I will get no support and my political career will reach like a very quick end. That doesn't encourage a lot of people to run with the NDP. That doesn't encourage a lot of people to get like, become a part of that movement. That doesn't encourage a lot of voters either to vote for them either. It continues to perpetuate this cycle of like not really caring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like if the NDP could actually prove to people that they would do the policies that the Liberals promise, the NDP would definitely, skyrocket in popularity. Because, again, it's politics, it's the media. The media doesn't help the NDP. The media is often biased against the NDP, much like your media is biased usually against the Squad. And since Canadians don't know about bills that are passing or anything like that, or what will often happen is that the NDP will try to, pass a motion or pass a bill to say, okay, we want $10 a day universal childcare. And then that will get voted down. But then come election time, the Liberals are like, oh, so we're going to promise $10 a day childcare for everyone without any mention. And then the media will report on what the Liberals said, but not mention that the NDP was trying to push it through first, and that the Liberals actually voted it down. I think part of it is the system is just so confusing. It's so complicated. Many Canadians don't know how our parliamentary system, how our political system works. Like, at least when it comes to passing bills and things of that sort, I think we have a much easier time in the States than you guys do in the States, but that's not necessarily a good thing, because when a party's in a majority, there's nothing stopping them. They just pass through whatever they want. Because, we have a standard set process of the 3 readings in the House and the Senate, and then it's in or not. And you are obligated almost to vote within party lines. If you don't, then you can run the risk of being kicked out of the party. And if you're kicked out of the party and you try to run as an independent, it's virtually impossible to win a seat as an independent. And then if you get into Parliament and you're an independent, you have no power to do anything anyway. So you have to go with what the party says. You don't have much wiggle room unless they actually give you permission to vote your conscience. And that usually happens on things like, oh, who wants to ban conversion therapy? Well, not the Conservatives, or the Conservatives, they tried in the last Parliament to put a bill forth that would ban abortions based on gender. And for some of those things, the Liberal government has a little bit more wiggle room. If 1 or 2 of their people want to vote with the Conservatives, those sorts of things, they tend not to care so much. But as soon as it comes to things like, there was a motion passed by the NDP to ask Justin Trudeau's government to stop taking Indigenous children and survivors of residential schools to court. And dozens and dozens of the Liberals just abstained from voting. Justin Trudeau didn't even show up that day for that vote. And he hasn't stopped. Luckily, there was a win for them, for the Indigenous peoples, in the courts recently, saying that the government does actually have to pay them out. Because, again, it's so much more complicated than people realize. Indigenous peoples don't get the same health care as I do. They're completely federally run. My healthcare is more provincially run. So they've had to take the government to court many times to try to get the help they need, the support they need for their medical issues, and the government likes to refuse it. And, survivors of residential schools are trying to get some sort of compensation, some sort of payment, some sort of acknowledgement, and for the pain and suffering and the generational abuse that they've been through. And the government fights them tooth and nail for that. They don't want to pay out. They don't want to set that precedent. So I want to have faith that things can change, but after having this election and seeing literally nothing change, like the seat count is almost identical. The NDP only picked up one seat, despite the fact that of all the major parties, they were the only ones to gain votes. So all the other parties lost votes in that election, except for the PPC, which gained the most amount of votes out of all the parties, which was, again, very, very disconcerting. So the amount of support that the NDP would have to have in order to really make a dent, to really get the seat count, would rely on mainstream media also backing them up to some extent, which they're not going to do, because how many people get their news from, the young people tend to get their news from online, but a lot of the older folks still, it's the cable news. They see a quick rundown. That's that. Like in these elections where I mentioned some of the candidates stepped down, the one close to here where he had to step down a couple weeks, like just a day after it was the point of no return of taking your name off the ballot. So virtually the entire campaign, he wasn't on it. He still got 8,000 votes because people weren't paying attention and they just saw a Liberal beside his name and voted for him.
Yeah, that's those are the dynamics sort of like at play and that are up against with the left. And so to wind down, I want to ask what does it look like on the ground essentially? Because you mentioned there's, at least in America, there's a lot of conversation about what does it look like outside of politics? How do we organize and mobilize and strategize outside of the political system? Because there is a lot of a lack of faith within our elected officials, even the ones who are closely allied with us. And so more and more people are looking to outside of the normal bounds of politics for hope, if you will. So do you see like major movements on the ground there? What are some things, like some strengths that are going on? Like I know mutual aid's popping off, at least in a lot in North America. Naturally, that's not enough though. So what do you see about the sustainability, really fast in just a couple minutes that we have here, about the sustainability of the left outside of the political system in Canada?
There are definitely lots of wonderful movements on the ground. There's a good chance that the city of Toronto will be taken to court because of the police violence. And that's, through grassroots doing the work, taking the pictures and stuff, because the mayor of Toronto tried to claim that there was no violence from the police and that in one of the clearings there were no police there. And yet all the activists have the photos, they have the proof. So the ground level grassroots movements, they do make a difference, but those usually end up having to go through courts. It doesn't go through the government in bills. It's usually the courts having to make decisions, and it's the grassroots pushing for that sort of thing. And I think if enough work together and enough court decisions are made on a certain topic, then, finally the government will actually represent the people and start making bills and laws that will reflect that. But it really is up to the grassroots movements to do this. And I do have hope when I see them on the ground, taking the pictures, documenting things, going to court, trying to push to make the lives of everyone better. Because even now in Ontario, I know there's a movement starting to try to double what people on disability are getting so that, we can get $2,000 a month. And that's doubling it because we're only just over $1,000 a month. And, average rent in Ontario for one bedroom is $1,400. So you kind of have to hang on to whatever apartment you have or you're in trouble. But there's movements to take the government to court about that. So it really is the grassroots movements. I just wish, again, like the left, there can be a lot of movements about the same topic, but they're blind to what each other are doing. And they need to start, coalescing and working together. And, like our BML movement needs to team up with your BML movement so that we can start trying to make these changes together on both sides of the border, because I see that's how both of our countries will benefit. Both of our countries will grow that way if we start working together. Because again, if we do something but you guys don't, then eventually we're going to be dragged back down. And if you guys do something but we don't, we're going to be dragged back down. So it really has to be a cross-border attempt at this.
I think that's a profound advice. And it's stuff that you're constantly hammering away at left of the box on your YouTube channel, which I enjoy for getting my fix of Canadian politics. The leftist Canadian creator space is flourishing, I would say, right now. And I would say you're one of the wonderful parts of that as well. So thank you very much, Sandee, for coming on to
Thank you.
Power Report. I hope to have you back again and to be back on your show, hopefully sooner rather than later.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was a wonderful interview just there from Sandee of Left of the Box. Make sure you check that out on YouTube. All the links will be in the description. And now we head to with German politics. We're switching gears now from North America to Europe. Sean, Power Report regular, audio face camaraderie, here to join us here. And God, I'm really loving this episode because I get to talk about politics and learn a lot more about other places and just do it with some folks I really enjoy. And so German politics is hella interesting. There's so many ways that it's interesting, and I, of course, like Sean will go into it right now. But it's German politics has been something both Sean and I have followed for a long amount of time, like within our friendship. But I think it's interesting just for folks who don't even have a family lineage in like German or interesting at all. I found a lot of interest in Germany just in my college studies because I was studying political economy, kind of like the politics of economic systems and the economics of political systems and how they intertwine and interconnect, as opposed to poli-sci or economics, which are just taught separately. But Germany is a really interesting case study in political economy. Karl Marx is from Germany, the biggest critic of capitalism and its structures. A lot of those thinkers come from Germany and Eastern Europe, all from that sort of like area. And as a result, you get a lot of really interesting political structures there. Germany's healthcare system is often lauded as one of the best in the world and as a model that the United States could actually take for. But it's actually a public-private system, for example. So there's aspects of that that conservatives could actually appreciate if they were in good faith interested in actually getting a healthcare system going on. But all of this is centered around Angela Merkel, who has been a really kind of important grounding rock, like a centering force, not just for German politics, but for Europe as a whole through much of the late 90s and the like 2000s, just sort of being a central powerhouse of Europe that is, historically had a difficult time keeping even the countries within the European sort of like sect and bloc peaceful and working together. Through Angela Merkel's leadership just in Germany and also like on the EU sort of stage has led to a period of, not perfect things and a lot of austerity throughout going there, CC Greece. But like you also have, again, in the broad strokes of European history, a period of stability and peace and, neoliberal behavior there. So that being said, Angela Merkel has had her time and she is now handing off the reins of power to whoever's taking on in the, sort of the CDU, CSU sort of like coalition system. And so that is all to say, Angela Merkel is a really major figure in politics, and her leaving and kind of leaving a power vacuum there has created a lot of interesting dynamics in Germany. So beyond that intro I just gave, Sean, like I want you to kind of talk about Angela Merkel's sort of like influence and legacy through her leadership. And then, like, as we kind of alluded to earlier, kind of go into a broad picture of the German political landscape just before we got to this election. So, like, we'll talk about the election afterwards, but what was it like before?
So, I mean, Angela Merkel has been in power for about 16 years, I'd like to say. Big powerhouse in European politics. She's, one of the most powerful women in the world. She really brought the CDU-CSU. For those of you who don't know, that's the Christian Democrat Union and the Bavarian sister party. They're basically two together. She brought that party more towards the center because the CDU-CSU is the center right, the rightish party of Germany. She would bring that more to the center and try to get more younger voters and more like leftish ideas into the party, and really had like a strength hold on Germany for a long time, where the CDU would win, 40% of the votes and stuff in elections up until this one. But we'll get to that in a little bit. And more with her, she like for a long time was a really big political figure. It still is, but she now literally says, I'm tired and I want to step down because I've been doing this for too long. But at the beginning of her rise of power and stuff in the 2000s, she was one of like the heads of the CDU, or like was slowly rising up, became the head, got voted in, and did a lot of different reforms within healthcare, education, and really strengthened up the Germany economy and got it to be really the big central figure in Europe. Really was pushing for like a big European coalition within the EU and everything, and was pretty known like that to try and help European countries around and get it to be one big consolidated Europe and not try to have all these different currencies, different things going on. Because remember, you had so many different wars that happened in Eastern European countries in the late 90s. I mean, Germany wasn't reunited until 1989. And so you had a lot of stuff going on that she really wanted to try and protect Europe as a whole.
I just want to like pause on that really clear, because a lot of Americans don't get that history. The Cold War was not the end of conflict in like that central part of Europe by any means. And so like what you're saying, Angela Merkel kind of came at this moment in where she wanted to not just like present a unified Germany so it can like kind of grow and like modernize in a global, like post-Reagan Thatcher economic system, but also just try to project peace in a very tumultuous area. And so that last has to be said about her role in that.
Yeah, and she really wanted to try and unite Germany as much as she could in a way, because you can't really talk about German politics without talking about, East and West. There's still like a cultural divide. There's still a big economic divide and stuff between East and West, even though they've been united. They were united before I was even born, but you still have a lot of problems between East and West, where the West, where West Germany was, tends to be a little bit more rich, a little bit more well off. East tends to be a little bit more economically downtrodden compared to the West. So you still have a lot of resentment and stuff towards each other, cultural stuff here or there. And it's very difficult for people who don't know a lot of German culture and kind of the history of all of the region to get an understanding of that. But one big figurehead one big kind of uniter was Merkel, because she would try and get the center right party to be more towards the center, more of their neoliberal ideas, and try to have some type of consolidation throughout Germany, and try to have like a solid foundation throughout Germany, and try to have that, because Germans like that. They like to have the same thing. They don't really like to have too much change or whatnot.
Stereotypically, as a people, exactly. We're starting to get into like I'm not blaming you, but like that. There's the whole joke about German jokes, and it's just like a stated fact. Like it's just it's a cultural thing. It's true.
Yeah, it is. But the interesting part is later on in her career, then when younger people, our generation, and Gen Z, they started to want more change. They wanted more left ideas. They wanted more things, especially with more climate change stuff, because Germany is a very green nation. They're really Germans are literally obsessed about trying to be as energy efficient as possible. I mean, if you go there, we have 9 different trash cans to organize all of our recycling and trash and everything. So I'm not joking. There's things for everything. So everything is try to not create as much waste as possible. But the big thing with that, I think, derailed her a lot was towards her last maybe about 7 or 8 years of power. She had the big immigration policy to try and have immigrants come up through Germany. and which I'm all for in a way. Like I like having multicultural societies and stuff, and I think it's good for Germany in the long run. But when she did that, it created a lot of animosity towards immigrants, especially in the east and the south of Germany, and that ended up bringing back the rise of the far right. And then there was all of these other political scandals, corruption scandals, and stuff within the CDU and within Merkel herself. There was the whole Brexit thing with England and a couple other stuff within European countries that, towards the latter end of her reign of power as the chancellor, as the chancellor, for those who don't speak German, that really kind of derailed and ended up, the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of resentment was starting to go towards her, towards the CSU, and you see this now within this past election and the divide within the younger populations, the different voter structures and everything, and then the rise of the far right, the AfD of Germany, and more flat statements and stuff, and really these big anti-immigrant sentiments and stuff within the south, within the east of Germany, and a lot of that was perpetrated by her not handling the situation very well. Of you have all these immigrants and stuff happening because U.S. imperialism and shit, don't like to change, and all these other wars and stuff in the Middle East. These people need somewhere to go, and a lot of countries weren't letting them in. Merkel said, "Hey, come up. We'll let you do this and that," because they like. The big thing with Germans is we want to have a good eye on the world. So try to have people think that we're a peaceful nation, that we let people in because of our history and our past. And issue with Merkel, when she did that, she didn't really have a good enough plan to let people in. She just let people in and didn't have any big, I would say, good ideas to have any assimilation into the German population. So now you have a lot of resentment towards immigrants in Germany, especially like a lot of Turkish immigrants, a lot of Middle Eastern immigrants and stuff, all predominantly Muslim in the northern Germany, settled there. A lot now are in southern Germany, Europe, in Bayern, state Bavaria. And now you have a lot of animosity and stuff towards that, which I think could have been prevented if things went smoother, if things were done a little bit different. And I think that's gonna like the biggest stain in her political career.
Yeah, I think, and you were very clear in this, but like to be very clear, I don't think it's that like, it's not that Angela Merkel bringing immigrants into Germany was a bad call. You're not saying that. You're just saying
No.
by not
it's the way she did it.
Yeah, by not having a plan. I draw parallels to Joe Biden's pullout of Afghanistan, the situation with Haitian migrants right now. It's like, I think America.
Actually, it's a really big parallel. I was thinking that the other day of the Haitian immigrants. I go, this sounds very similar to Germany, except we don't send cops and like just throw them out. We still let them in
anymore.
Right.
But really fast, I want to get to high level, because we're starting to throw around these names like CDU, CSU. Let's talk about the political parties. Let's break them down.
So, for those of you who don't know, like the structure in Germany, it's a parliamentary system. So each party has a certain amount of power, and each party is a little bit different than others. So the two biggest ones, one you just talk about this whole time, is the CDU and /CSU. They're the center-right party, the Christian Democrat Union, and the Bavarian Sister Party. You have the second biggest party, is the SPD, the Social Democrats, which is the center-left party. Those are the two ones that have the most power, and they've shared coalition governments for as long as I've been alive, just about, until now. But they've been the two biggest in power, before Merkel, the SPD was in power. I cannot think of the chancellor before her in 2000, but it's me.
And then really fast, like just broadly speaking, we'd consider the union between the CDU, CSU, and like pure ass English, we consider that to be like a center-right kind of coalition, while the SPD, even though they have like the Social Democratic Party of Germany in their name, they're not social democrats. They're kind of more center-left. They're moderate.
Yeah, they're definitely center-left. They're way more moderate than, for sure. After that, you have Die Grünen, which means the Green Party. They are the more, I'd say, more left left-leaning party. They're very focused on green energy. Like in one of their mission statements, they want green energy to be in every single policy that they have, and any taxing anything they do is thrown towards green energy, thrown towards trying to fight off climate change and all that. You have the FDP, which is the more I guess libertarian party, where they're more focused on businesses. They don't want as much like tax cuts and stuff for the wealthy and all that. You know those people. We have them here. You have the AfD, which is the Alternative for Deutschland, the far right extremist party. Very big anti-immigrant statements with them. Now with when Donald Trump rise to power and when he was in president, a lot of the sentiments that you get here in the U.S., you got as Germany as well through the AfD. And you have Die Linke, which literally means in German the left. They are the most left party of Germany. They are more of your you have a lot of socialists in there. You have social democrats. They'll be more of the government regulation, trying to get much as welfare for people as much as they can, regulate businesses, energy, all that stuff. And that's kind of like a rundown on the political parties. There's a lot of different ones.
I would say that those are the parties that have like some semblance of representation.
Well, they're the ones that have.
Yeah, in Bundestag. Yeah, right. So
yeah, in Bundestag, those are the ones that have people in seats.
Because you've definitely got other parties. You've got more left parties. I don't want to start that can of worms in the comment section, right?
You have communist parties. You have like the Marxist parties and stuff. You have even more right parties than the AfD as well. But they're really small. We'll get to that in a second. But that's kind of gives you an overview of it. But how it works in Germany for like the political process is you don't vote for a candidate. You vote for a party who then puts in a central figurehead or two, depending on the party, as their representative leaders.
Very similar to, I was just going to say, just for the context of this episode, similar to Canada.
Yes, very similar to Canada. And with Angela Merkel, she stepped down as the head of the CDU. After the last election, I think about 2 years ago, she said, that's it. Like after this term is up, I'm going to be stepping down as the head of the CDU. And then there was a big fight for power, and it ended up being Armin Laschet, who's the head of the CDU, taking control of the party, and that had big ramifications for this election. But that's why we talked about Merkel before, kind of like her legacy, everything, kind of the history of her, a little bit of German politics, European politics in general. And now with her stepping down, the CDU has changed and shifted more towards the right, which had a profound impact on this election with the way it turned out. But we should get into that right now.
Yes, please tell me. So what were the results of the election, broadly speaking? Who came out on top?
It's September 26th, I believe. Again, you vote for a party, and then the party has people. So what ended up happening with this election was the SPD, the center-left party, won about 26% of the vote, and the CDU won 25% of the votes. So there isn't a majority. There isn't a majority win, even though the SPD said, and Olaf Scholz, the head of the SPD, came out made a big speech. We won, blah blah blah. Technically, they did win, but they need to create a government. This is what happens in the parliamentary system. You have to now make coalitions with other parties to have enough percentage of the whole entire vote to then make a government. This is where it gets fun. It's not like in the US, right, where you have basically a two-party system, more or less, and whoever has the most, you vote for that candidate, they win. And here, you vote for the parties with the most percentage of votes wins, but within creating a government, you have to have a majority share of the parliamentary seats. So now the Grünen had about, I think, 12% of the vote or 11% of the vote after the CDU, which is a big uptick from the previous election. I think they had the biggest uptick in percentage votes, especially among younger people. And now it's a fight for power of now the SPD and the CDU trying to go into talks with the different parties to see how many people they can get in, what they can consolidate, what different things they can do to then create a government. So right now it's a giant fight for power on who's going to control the German government. And I know Olaf Scholz, he made a big promise. He says he wants it done in November, which good luck. And right now, Merkel is still technically the chancellor. She's not chancellor. She's not going to get out until the new government is in charge and has been created and formed. And then after that, then she's out. After that, and then it's going to be for sure a male in charge of Germany for the first time in 16 years, which is kind of crazy to see. But right now,
no more girl boss energy coming out of Deutschland.
No more girl boss energy, exactly. No more, yeah. That's not nice things. Wrong country. Right now, they're going in German. It's Sodereringsgespräche, which is like your preliminary talks. So what's going on is now in between each of the parties, they're talking and trying to get their feet wet of who's going to form a coalition. Once they like figure out what compromises and stuff, then they go to Koalitionsgespräche, which is the coalition talks. And now that's when they'll be, okay, we can form a coalition within these certain regards. So right now you have talks. The SPD and Die Grünen are talking because they're the more left parties in Germany, and obviously the Green Party, they want as much policies with renewable technologies, within climate change policies. They want as many of that as they can get within the SPD. They really want to work with them on that because they think they can do that more than the CDU. Interestingly, kind of a curveball within the election as well is that the FDP, I think, had the where they were right behind the SPD within the election results. So they also have a say in who can form a government as well. And they're the Libertarian Party. So they're big on not wanting to do these different welfare systems, not doing too many tax cuts for the wealthy and all of that. While the Green Party wants more taxes taken out of the wealthy to then fund more of the welfare programs and stuff in Germany, especially because of more immigrants are coming in. You're having to have a bigger budget for all of that. And now they're trying to see which of the main two, the SPD or the CDU, creates that coalition between the Green Party and the FDP, the Libertarian Party, to then create a government. So it's a giant clusterfuck of trying to micromanage, micro deal, do all these back things of whoever's going to be the most happy. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens. It's going to be months long, honestly. But it has huge ramifications for Europe because whatever coalition comes out of it, they're the big center heads of the European Union. So, example, if it's the SPD, CDU, and the Green Party union, they're going to have, I call it the traffic light variation because the colors of them are yellow, red, and green of this CDU, SPD, and Green Party. If that happens, the SPD will have the most in charge, but the Green Party will also have a lot of voice for the first time, really, in German politics, to have a big voice within making giant policy statements. That's going to have big ramifications for Europe because having them, the Green, have that much control, they can now set standards for the European Union for other countries around the world of, hey, look, we're doing all of these tax policies, all these other things to get into green energy. And within there, that can have an effect within other countries to see looking as a leading example. That's their big goal. Really never before have you had three parties have this much control in Germany. It's almost always been the SPD and CDU. Every time one is in power more than the other, but they always make a coalition government. That's what happened last time. The FDP head literally walked out on talks last election cycle, literally said, I would rather, it's better to have no government than a government that I don't agree with. Auf Wiedersehen, and walked off. It's one of my favorite things ever in German politics because it's hilarious. So these talks are vicious. They're very important. They're brutal. They're long, and they have big ramifications for the world, honestly. So Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. We got water. 1 second.
Yeah, all good. I think the interesting thing here will be like it looks like the SPD like overall will come out like the top dogs in the situation. Like not totally. They need to
More like yes.
yeah. They need to like obviously build a coalitional government, and that coalitional government will create roadblocks because you'll have to, much like you do in the American system, you'll have a couple of members of the Bundestag, the German parliament there, who will form coalitions on particular issues, maybe
Correct.
on the interests of their particular localities, maybe on their financial interests, probably
Yep.
on their financial interests, and
Yep.
so you'll have these like very stubborn like groups of people creating roadblocks regardless in the system. But I think it's really important here to think about like the SPD as a hello fly, the SPD as it exists in um Germany, and who like Olaf Scholz like is as a leader, because he comes from the kind of center, like it's hard to say the center right of the SPD, but like it's a
Yes,
center
he's the more
left party. So he's
conservative-ish
yeah,
of the SPD.
he was I just
Yes.
want to say really fast, he was in support of, so back in 2010 when like everyone was recovering from the economic
Yep.
recession, Germany was especially hit hard, and because of Germany's interesting position in the European Union, it was sort of responsible for, or like had a big role in the monetary policy of other countries in Europe, such as Spain, such as Greece, such as France, because they shared a currency. In the United States, we can do things with monetary policy involving, the Federal Reserve, or we can do things that are separate from the Federal Reserve involving fiscal policy, which involves Congress and the president, things like that.
Yes.
But in Germany, you have to think about, okay, the European Central Bank is not really just the control of Germany's, it's the whole like European system. But whoever are the bigger, more successful players in that have an outsized role in that system because of that shared currency. And so around that time, Germany was leading leading the call for a lot of austerity measures, basically raising a lot of taxes, not only on the richest people, but also on folks who were um not like doing so well like economically, and that had like ramifications politically in Greece and a lot of other different places, leading to a lot of their
Mhm.
rising far right governments and things like that. And so it really kind of became a case study at that moment for ensuring that you I guess like it kind of became a case study for where you stood as a leftist, especially because in response to this, in other parts of the world, you had Occupy movements as like a leftist
Correct.
response to all the things that were happening um, in these austerity measures, and this like unequal response to the economic crisis, where it seemed like the rich continued to get richer while people who were struggling just harder, and more people were joining the struggling ranks. And so, all that being said, Olaf Scholz was on the wrong side of history in that, very much so, and supported a lot of the austerity level like kind of policies, and the left wing has pretty much hated him ever since. That being said,
Yes.
that's how you get power, not just in Germany, but in like world politics,
Yeah.
it seems.
In Western politics, baby.
Yeah. So, what balance do you think Olaf will be able to ride in office? And do you think it's gonna be like more of like Angela Merkel's status, where it's sort of like shifting in between? Sorry, being long winded about this, but it's sort of like Angela Merkel sometimes would understand that, okay, this is not the way I want to govern. This is not the way the CSU or the CDU want me to govern, but this is the way Germany's going, a la like marriage equality, for example.
Yeah.
So let it pass. Do you think that Olaf Scholz will do that more for the left, or do you think more often than not he will continue to be a roadblock to progress, a la a Joe
It
Biden?
depends. It depends on who the coalition's formed with. If they have like the coalition where Grünen has a big say, then he cannot be a roadblock in a way because they won't have enough votes to roadblock a lot of stuff, depending on certain things. But if they make deals with the FDP, the more Libertarian Party instead, and they form coalition within them, then you're going to have a lot more roadblocks within leftist policies. The interesting thing, though, within this election cycle, is that the voter base really had their say that they don't want right politics in Germany. So what happened with the CDU is that their head Armin Laschet was pushing the party more to the right, more and more to the right. They had this party elder, for lack there of a better term, Friedrich Merz, who's a really big, or was a big political head, but they has a lot of power and say in the CDU, and he's a big um, economically right people, where he wants more stuff for businesses and more things like more like traditional German values, this and that. But the people really didn't respond well to the CDU doing that, and that's how they lost like so many votes, was because of that. And who gained the most out of it was the Green Party. The Green got a shit ton of those votes from the CDU that the CDU would normally get, especially within younger voters, because the Green Party was saying, hey, we're more left leaning, obviously. We want to have more of a say with everything, our political stuff within climate change and all of that. And that's where they gained the most amount. So within that, with Olaf Scholz's SPD, they have to listen to the people. They have to listen to the Grünen and come up with some type of compromise within creating a coalition government of what policies can they do to have as much green stuff as possible within what the Green Party says, because the people really said that they wanted that. And seeing how much this CDU lost power, because mind you, before this, 2 election cycles ago, last election cycle, relatively speaking, CDU had a ton of power. They would win 40% of the vote, 50% of the vote, because they were known as the People's Party. They were known as the party of the regular everyday person. And now they're not. They shifted more towards the right, especially with Angela Merkel stepping down. I mean, that shit gaining power. So Olaf Scholz knows that. He's been in German politics for a long time, so he can't be too big of a roadblock to be able to stay in power. Because if they end up, making a coalition with the CDU and it ends up just being a normal government that was before, they're going to lose power. They're going to get out of having those two parties be the big heads, and you're already seeing it right now with this past election cycle. So. It's interesting. There's a lot to think about, a lot to say with it.
Yeah, I see, once again, like, not to do so much of a thing. I'm trying in this episode not to only to draw parallels between the United States and other countries, not to say that, oh, it's exactly like this. We should reduce politics to an understanding of only the United States, because I think that's not only is it reductive, and
It's
it can
dangerous in a way too,
absolutely, it gets dangerous in a way, but it
because
also,
then you could think of, oh, you only have two parties here, but look, in Germany now you have a three-party coalition government.
yeah,
There's no ways about it. You can't have a two-party. You're gonna have to have a third party.
you miss a lot of local nuances, and you lose a lot of actual, like, perspective at, like, what can actually
Yes.
be done in different, like, political universes. So understand that I'm only
Yes.
coming at it from that position. But that being said, I think that there's a lot of parallels in the idea that this is kind of a do or die moment for the SPD in Germany, because you are getting rising movements in
Hmm.
the right wing as well, through AFD, through some of, like, the more extreme folks that are coming from the CDU and the CSU, like it's
Yes and no.
yeah.
The AfD actually lost a lot of power compared to last election, and they lost. I think out of everybody other than the CDU, they lost the most as well. I think they lost maybe about 4% of what they did last election cycle. So they're losing traction and everything, but they're here to stay.
And I would
It's a
also
big
say that a lot of, because of their existence, they've forced other parties
yeah,
to go a little bit further right. Like, they will always have that, like, sort of lasting impact, even if it kind of, like, loses in the seats. And also there's that impact in the culture. These issues
yeah,
involving, like, immigration are
for
going to
sure.
continue, but, like, that is an important distinction to make there. But yeah, the fact that the SPD and sort of the center left has to be a little bit less center left, because, I guess to correct myself, a lot of the energy in German politics is on the left wing, especially involving the environment, especially
Mm,
involving social issues. But you do have efforts working against that pretty actively in German and European business,
yes.
in yeah, this new like libertarian thing with the FDP. I think it's really interesting, but not as interesting as what's going on in Berlin, because this is one of the most hard in the paint things ever. So I a long story short, the best way I can describe this, and the shortest way I can describe this, is that jelly donuters, Berliners themselves, offered to deep state German joke right there. They basically voted to expropriate and like take over land and like luxury residential property and then offer it to like, Germans who need it in the city of Berlin for like highly subsidized rates. I mean, like taking all of the economic finance jargon out of it, they literally just took property and are giving it to people. Like, and essentially, yeah. Or they're making it really cheap
The
to
thing
do
with
so.
Berlin too is it's such a multicultural place. You have so many different people that live there. It's not like your typical, it's not Bavaria or the south of Germany where you get your typical Germans. Berlin is so diverse. You have all these different melting pots of people and whatnot there. So you have a lot of discrepancies between people. It's not as bad as like the port city of Hamburg or a little bit in the north of Bremen and other cities that have a lot of immigrants as well. But within Berlin, you have that big multicultural hub, and you have more immigrants and stuff there as well that need help, and you have Germans there that need help, and it's such a cool thing that they did that to just do that little part where Berlin's a pretty expensive place. There's a lot of housing available, and to now give it to some people that need it is it's a really cool thing, I thought.
Yeah, now there's important things to note. So the measure is not legally binding. It's more just like
No.
it's an on the record recommendation that the people of Germany have essentially voted to, yeah, expropriate these large corporate landlords and make it so you could like, yeah, and the vote 1 in 10 of Berlin's 12 districts make it so the city could actually do something to fight against rapidly rising rents. I mean, it's the same thing that's happening in major cities across the
Hmm.
world where at the same time you have a very visible crisis with people being unhoused that was only exacerbated by COVID-19. At the very time you have a situation where young people who weren't totally able to get on their feet after the economic crisis of the 2008 to 2010s
Hmm.
are now facing the dual economic crises of COVID-19 and everything that's coming with that, having a more difficult time getting access to housing and other services, even in a place like Germany where you do get a lot of these social services available.
There's
Um,
tons.
Added to the fact that there's an increasing um, gap between that first group of people we were just talking about who are at the very edges of society or like a lot of people just like barely struggling to make it through, and then the ultra rich who are not even utilizing these properties or often using them as just like investment properties. A lot of times they sit empty or just like not even fully there. But yeah, it was a years long campaign from leftist activists who like worked on the streets together and like talked to German residents, like really mobilized on this issue, and they voted to expropriate more than 240,000 privately owned apartments. Um, and the campaign was promptly named Deutsche Wohnen and Co. Enteignen, which means
Which,
expropriate Deutsche Wohnen and Company. Um, it
yeah.
defied negative polling, it defied warnings from business leaders and the media, and so I think it's a really amazing opportunity, or at least an example. Definitely, it's an opportunity for leftists mobilizing outside the political system in Germany to see what can be done, at least what kind of message can be sent. Of course, you need to like build the legal teeth around this to make sure it works, but what kind of message can be sent when you do actually work together? Uh, I think in a situation like Germany, for example, where it's so hard to get the left to organize and actually collaborate and get to working together in a proper way, it's a good example of what could be possible when the left can kind of work together and like kind of like stop getting into petty arguments and disagreements and actually say, hey, these is for the record the changes that we want to see in the world,
Hmm.
the tangible changes.
Yeah, yeah. My joke always on Power Report about dysfunctional left. You don't know dysfunctional left. Look at the Linka Party, man. They are crazy. They could do so good. Like they do so much good if just if they just organized. That's such a big thing, and you get that all over across the world and everything. Um, but that the housing thing is awesome. I think it's yeah. When I heard about that, I was like, that's insane and cool. And Benin needs that because of how expensive it is to live there. Granted, you do have a lot of um, subsidies and other things in Germany that you don't get, especially in the U.S. because the U.S. doesn't give a shit about people. Even with those helpings of welfare systems and other things, child credits, public tuition, free public tuition colleges and all that stuff, you still need help, especially with COVID and how it's affected so many people. And you mean you're still coming, it's only 10 years past the recession too. So it's 11 years past with that. So yeah, it's a really cool idea. I like it.
Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating that Franziska Giffey, who has just been elected the mayor of
Yep.
Berlin on the SPD like party,
Yes.
was originally against this and like didn't back the bill, but it's now like, okay, I guess we'll have to draft it and like, okay, we'll have to listen to
And,
people and do something.
and
But
that's the thing with Germany is that like within the politics, you have to listen to people in it, relatively speaking. The people have a big voice in there, which is something that I really like.
I would say bigger, but I think
I mean, yeah.
yeah, more often than not, like corporate interests, like international corporate interests in capitalism, like win out the day.
No
Um,
shit. Oh, always,
yeah, yeah.
always.
And I think it will go to see like, okay, how far will this actually go? So it'll be important for that the insurgent leftist movement that helped get this defy all the odds in this to continue to put the pressure on the local level and to use international pressure and support and get people in the media to talk about this as well. I'd love to talk to some people from Berlin in the future, and definitely Sean, you come on for that episode and talk about like what it's like on the ground organizing there in that kind of
Yeah.
space, because I think maybe the audience can kind of get from these past two things, uh, two like segments here. I think getting to a place of leftist solidarity
Mhm.
internationally, um, not just will help us see like the bigger issues at play here and will help us get past some of like the pettier differences, I at least hope, or at least help some
Yeah.
people get
Yeah.
past the petty differences. You'll always have people who are petty by default, but it will actually help build tangible power, because if you have elected members of um leftist parties in Germany speaking on climate and passing climate legislations in a forceful way at the same time, and the same way as folks are in other countries like in Canada and the United States, in um, places in Latin America, places in Asia. Like there are a lot of other places where I think like this could possibly start to take a hold potentially. Um, Imagine how much power that can be by drawing an international narrative and an international discussion about this and showing that solidarity and giving people a chance to imagine something greater than the political malaise that we're like currently experiencing. So those are all things I think would be interesting to see in the future. Um, and I guess the last thing I did want to end on, because like it is the elephant in the room, is like kind of concerning, is that like we already said like, yeah, off day they have lost a little bit of power here. Um, but there's still that cultural festering. Like you could easily report outside of the United States that okay, Joe Biden won the presidency. The Democrats have a narrow majority in the Senate. The moderate Republicans that do exist in the Senate have to act like fairly moderate. They can't be super Trump outgoing. You have a lot of Trump loving Republicans in the House per se, but the House is a different story, and there's a Democratic majority in the House. So an outside international observer could look at that and go, America is rejecting extremism. But of course, we live in the United States. We know, like,
Mhm.
like racial
Mhm.
resentment has like never been higher, and you can feel that temperature rising. And Uncle Joe isn't necessarily putting water on that fire. So, like, what what do you feel like there might be a similar thing happening where okay, they're out of power in Germany, but there can be cultural fears and things that are stoked potentially there and could be utilized and exploited the next time elections come around?
My hope is no, but with the rise of the AfD and the history of Germany's mainly the fall of the wall and everything, and the Wiederaufbau, the reunification, um, it's more than likely going to stay. You'll have like the past couple of years, you've had a rise of extremism. You've had a lot of anti-Semitism. You've had a lot of anti-immigration stuff. A lot of that, honestly, was what they were seeing here in the U.S. There was like a lot of the extreme right. We're seeing Trump, like, say the things he did, all the stuff we know what happened. They took that and then brought that to Germany a bit, and you could see the repercussions of it. The nice thing within what I'm seeing now is you have a big contingency among younger people that they don't want that they want, a multicultural Germany. They want more people to come together, all that good sentiment and everything. You see it within the polling, within the voting of who voted for who. And the more time goes on, I think it'll slowly dissipate, but it's always going to linger. I mean, within a population of people, you're always going to have extremists, kind of no matter what. Um, and in Germany, it's going to take a long time, because the divide between peoples, between East and West, between even North and South, it's a lot. There's a lot of animosity towards each other. There's a lot of jealousy of who got what, who had better living conditions, what happened at the end, who got to keep their traditions, who didn't get to keep their traditions, who got better infrastructure, who didn't, this and that. And you have a lot of resentment towards each other, and it's not even been a generation past. So you have a lot of the animosity in there, and within that bubbling pot of just of pain, of anger, of a lot of confusion, everything else, you have these sentiments that now start rising. And within the rise of extremism in other countries, a lot in Eastern Europe, a lot in Russia, obviously here in the US, you then get that sentiment to other people. They see that and they're like, let's bring that here to Germany. We want, we want more traditional values. We want this and that. We want a Germany for Germans. I mean, Europe has a lot of racist sentiments. You have like Europeans, Europe for Europeans only, sentiments and stuff throughout it. You get that a lot in Italy, and that sentiment will be in Germany, and it's going to stay for a while. But my hope is within the younger people, within the younger coalitions and groups and stuff that form and all that, they can hopefully slowly oust that thinking, oust that out. I mean, but it's going to take time. I mean, especially within house, like the wall was not barely 30 years ago. So it's crazy.
Yeah,
I think that's something that doesn't get said enough too, is the divide between East and West. You're still going to have that.
Yeah, there's a North and South divide in Germany as well, but there's definitely an East and West divide also.
And I want one small tangent, and this is for Americans. As shitty as the AfD is, as racist as they are, as shitty as like their policies and extremely dangerous that they are, they're not running on taking away your health care or your school. As terrible as the extremists and stuff are in Germany, we still have an underlying base of coverage for peoples, which is ironic as hell compared to the right here, where they don't really give a shit about human life and they want to stomp on you any second they get. Like with AfD, they're not saying like, oh, hey, we need to privatize everything in healthcare and stuff. Maybe you get a little bit of that in the FDP because, libertarians like to think they're smug and everything. But it's just funny how no matter which party it is, it's never going to get rid of a lot of the safety net that you have established in Germany.
Because
it'll
it's
be
popular.
Little things here or there. It's extremely popular. Even people on the far right, they like it. They don't want to get rid of it.
And I think it goes to say as a lesson that once you implement something, it might be hard to do it kicking and screaming, because the people who are opposed to that social safety measure know that people will like it across multiple different measures of the aisle, of like
Yep.
political aisles, because it is a tangible benefit they are getting in their lives. They feel like the government's taking care of them. And if you can market it right and sell it right and get the economics right through it, people will enjoy it. And so
Correct.
I think that's one of a lot of lessons to take out of this episode. Again, don't draw exact parallels between countries, but compare, contrast, and use that to build a broader understanding of the world around you, and also how potentially there are solutions to make a difference that aren't being talked about in a lot of other places. But
Yeah. And
Sean,
I mean, I'm nowhere near an expert of German politics and everything. I've just been following it for, I don't know, 12, 13 years. So I like know a little bit about it, and obviously speak the language and remember German, so that helps. But there's so many different avenues and stuff you can get to look it up. Like for English speaking stuff, DW, Deutsche Welle is decent. I mean, they're a bit neoliberal naturally, but there's a lot of videos that they're posting on it for the elections that get you a decent idea of stuff. And then from there, you can go down different rabbit holes of different literatures and different stuff of finding out what the ramifications are of each different outcomes of all the coalitions that can happen, and to see what the ramifications are for that, for Europe, for Germany, and for across the world, and that can what that can help you decide to do with your organizing in whatever country you're in, wherever you are, to then help. I mean, obviously, we're a leftist podcast, so we prefer left ideas. But whatever it is, to help you do what you think is good for the good of humanity, I think is a good way to put it.
yeah, when it comes down to how you treat people, when it comes down to how to interact in politics,
Exactly.
use it to build a broader perspective of the world around you.
Exactly.
Great point. Sean, thank you very much. You can be found on episodes of Power Report like this, panel episodes of Power Report that we do, Audio Face show podcast we very much enjoy, getting a lot of fun on. You can find that at youtube.com/audiofacepod, or go to audioface.show for all of those links. You can find all of Sean's links and where to find him if you trust you, in the video description and the podcast description as well. You can find all the links to where I exist at Dan from the Web on Twitter, at Dan from the Internet on Instagram, at youtube.com/Dan from the Internet, where you might be watching this, or powerreport.world for the podcast and show Power Report. Thank you very much for watching and enjoying this episode. Again, also all the links to Sandee Lovas and Left of the Box and all the stuff that Sandee's doing there can also be found in the description as well. And we'll be back on the next episode of Power Report. Thank you very much again, and stay safe.